There is a lemon icebox pie in my mother's refrigerator right now, in a kitchen I have not stood in for 3 years, and I would bet you anything it has someone else's name written on the card taped to the lid. That pie was the one tradition in our house that never bent for anyone. Whoever's birthday it was, that was the flavor, no substitutions, no matter what anyone else wanted instead. My sister hated lemon. She still got lemon when it was my year, because my mother said fair was fair. I want you to hold on to that detail, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. The boundary I am about to tell you about is a small one, smaller than most people would think deserves a story at all. I never asked my mother for anything again. Not money, not advice, not a favor, not a birthday. I have not asked her for a single thing in 3 years, and I have not been home in that time either, and those two facts are the same fact wearing two different coats. I have thought a great deal, in the years since, about why it was that particular boundary and not some earlier, louder one that finally held. There had been harder years before it, years I could point to and say, reasonably, that should have been the one that broke something. This wasn't the worst thing my family ever did to me. It was, instead, the moment I finally ran out of some quiet reserve of patience I hadn't known I was drawing down for 3 decades. The way a well runs dry, not on the day of the worst drought, but on some ordinary Tuesday after, when nobody was even watching the water level. I should start with how it began, because the order matters, and because if I tell it out of order, you will draw conclusions that aren't fair to either of us. My name is Marin Whitfield. I'm 35 now, though I was 32 the year all of this cracked open, and I live in Portland, where I design gardens for a landscape architecture firm that mostly builds courtyards for hospitals and senior living campuses, the kind of green space nobody notices until they're the ones sitting in it, grieving or healing or waiting on bad news. I grew up in a town called Millbrook, Ohio, population small enough that everyone's mother knew everyone's business before it happened. I have one sibling, my younger sister Della, 3 years behind me, and for most of my childhood I loved her without complication, the way you love someone whose whole existence depends on you being kind to them. It's only looking back that I can see the shape of what was happening underneath that love the entire time. I should tell it in order, because the order is the only way any of it makes sense, and because I promised myself when I finally agreed to speak this out loud to someone that I would not shape it into something crueler than it actually was. My mother is named Carol. My father is Warren. He is a gentle, conflict-averse man who spent most of his life letting my mother make the decisions and simply agreeing with them afterward, and I don't say that with contempt. I understand him better now than I used to. Growing up, our house ran on an economy of attention that I didn't have language for until I was well into my 20s. Della was, from the earliest age I can remember, the child who needed things. She had asthma bad enough in elementary school that my mother kept an inhaler in every room of the house and one in the car, taped under the visor. She struggled in school in a way that required meetings with counselors and special accommodations and a tutor twice a week that my parents could not really afford. She was, later, the one who got into trouble. Nothing catastrophic, but enough. A car accident at 17 that wasn't her fault but required weeks of my mother driving her to physical therapy. A broken engagement at 24 that leveled her for the better part of a year. My mother met every one of these crises with a competence and a devotion that I found, as a child, genuinely beautiful to witness. My mother was good in an emergency. She still is. I want to be fair about that, because so much of what follows will sound like I'm building a case against her, and I am not. I am telling you what it costs a family when one person is allowed to be the emergency, over and over for 30 years, and another person is quietly assigned the job of being fine. I was the fine one. I want to say that plainly, the way the label was said about me for as long as I can remember, usually by an aunt or a family friend, usually meant as a compliment. Marin's just so easy. Marin doesn't need much. Marin can handle herself. I earned that reputation honestly. I was a good student. I didn't get into trouble. I moved through my adolescence with the kind of low-maintenance competence that adults reward by leaving you alone. Nobody ever sat me down and told me my job in this family was to not need anything. Nobody had to. I picked it up the way you pick up a regional accent, by being steeped in it long enough that it stopped sounding like anything at all. It just sounded like home. Our house itself told you everything about the arrangement, if you knew how to read it. Della's room was the larger of the two upstairs, because she needed the space for the nebulizer machine and the humidifier, and, later, for the corkboard covered in get well cards from the accident. Mine was smaller, at the end of the hall, and I liked it that way. Or told myself I did. Because it was quiet, and nobody came looking for me in it, which felt, at 10 and 12 and 14, like a kind of privilege rather than what it more honestly was, which was a kind of absence. My mother kept a corkboard of her own, in the kitchen, crowded with Della's doctor's appointments and school meeting reminders and physical therapy schedules, color-coded in a system only my mother fully understood, and somewhere in the corner of it, unremarked upon, was a single index card with my school picture day and the church youth group schedule, the entirety of what my mother needed to track for me. Because there was so rarely anything else to track. I don't say any of this to make my mother sound negligent, because she wasn't. Not in any way a court or a counselor would recognize. I was fed, driven places, hugged at bedtime, praised for my report cards. The neglect, if that's even the right word for something this quiet, lived entirely in the smaller currency of attention rather than care. In the difference between a mother who shows up because you are drowning and a mother who shows up because she simply wants to know how your Tuesday went. I don't think I articulated that difference to myself, not once, until I was well past 30. I only knew, the way children know weather without being able to name the pressure system behind it, that there was a particular kind of stillness in a room when nothing was wrong with Della, and that stillness never once felt to me like calm. It felt like waiting. Here is the first motif I want you to keep, because it will come back twice more before this is over, each time meaning something a little different than the last. When I was 9, I taught myself to make my own school lunches, not because my mother asked me to, but because I noticed one morning that she was standing in the kitchen with Della's inhaler in one hand and the phone in the other, trying to reach the school nurse before the bus came, and I understood. In the unspoken way children understand things, that this was not a morning to ask for help with a peanut butter sandwich. I made my own lunch. I made my own lunch most mornings after that, for years, and at some point it stopped being a workaround and became simply how our house functioned. My mother would say, if you asked her, that I was independent. I think what actually happened is that I learned very early to read a room for where the emergency was, and to make myself scarce from whatever wasn't it. The second motif is the pie. Every birthday, lemon icebox, no matter whose day it was, made from my grandmother's recipe, and it was the one ritual that felt, growing up, like proof that fairness existed in our house even when other things didn't add up evenly. Della's birthdays were bigger. That was simply a fact, the way weather is a fact, more people invited, more effort, sometimes a rented moon bounce in the backyard, Once, memorably, a petting zoo that showed up with a llama that ate my mother's rosebush down to the thorns while everyone laughed. My birthdays were smaller, quieter, cake and a few friends and my grandmother's pie, and I told myself for a long time that this was simply because Della needed more. Needed bigger gestures to counterbalance whatever else was going wrong in her life that particular year, and that I, needing less, required less. The pie was the thing that made the arithmetic feel even. Whatever else varied, the pie was constant, made specially, made for you, on your day. I did not understand, until I was 32 years old, how much weight I had quietly loaded onto one dessert. The third motif is a phrase, and it is the phrase that gives this story its title, and I promise you it did not arrive out of nowhere the day it landed the way it landed. My mother had said some version of it to me for as long as I could remember, in smaller doses, over smaller disappointments, long before it detonated the way it eventually did. "Don't make this about you, Marin," she said it when I cried, at 13, because my father missed my choir recital to take Della to an orthodontist appointment that could have been rescheduled. She said it when I was 22 and expressed, gently, that I wished my parents had come to my college graduation instead of staying home because Della was having a hard week after her breakup. Each time, the phrase did the same work. It took whatever I was feeling and relabeled it as a character flaw, a kind of grasping selfishness rather than what it actually was, which was a person noticing that she kept coming in second in her own family and finding that this hurt. I absorbed the phrase the way I absorbed everything else. I stopped saying what I felt, mostly because saying it only ever got me the same 4 words back, delivered gently, never cruelly. My mother was never cruel. That's important. But delivered with such total conviction that I started to believe them myself. I really did think, for years, that there was something faintly grasping about wanting my own turn. I should say, too, that leaving Millbrook did not feel, at 18, like an escape. It felt like the first time I had ever been given a room of my own that nobody else's emergency could walk into uninvited. I remember the specific, almost illicit pleasure of my first dorm room, small and ugly and entirely mine, and how strange it was to realize that no one there knew me as the easy one, or the fine one, or the sister of the girl who needed things. I was simply Marin, a name without a role attached to it yet, and I built the next 16 years of my life very deliberately around not letting anyone attach one again. I moved for college to a state school 2 hours from Millbrook, and I want to be honest and say that the distance was a relief in a way I didn't examine closely at the time. I built a life. I studied landscape architecture almost by accident, in a design elective I took to fill a schedule gap, and fell in love with the specific problem of it. How do you make a space feel safe and unhurried for someone who is frightened or in pain? And I chased that thread through graduate school and into a career that took me first to Cincinnati and then, 6 years ago, to Portland, 3,000 miles from the kitchen with the lemon pie in it. I called home every Sunday. I sent flowers for my mother's birthday. I showed up for the holidays I could afford to fly home for. I was, by any outside measure, a good daughter, a functioning daughter, an easy daughter. I did not examine, for a very long time, how much of that ease was actually a kind of vigilance, a permanent, low-grade attentiveness to whether it was safe, this week, to need anything. There is a scene from college I should mention here too, small on its own but part of the same long thread, because it's the first time I remember consciously noticing the pattern rather than simply living inside it without a name for it. I was a sophomore, and I'd made the dean's list, and I called home genuinely excited, wanting, for once, to just be the good news in the room instead of the easy one. My mother answered distracted, half her attention already somewhere else, and when I told her, she said, "That's wonderful, honey," in a voice that meant it and didn't have room for it at the same time. And then, almost in the same breath, told me Della had gotten placed on academic probation, and could I please, when I had a minute, call my sister and tell her it wasn't the end of the world, because Della wouldn't hear it from anyone else the way she'd hear it from me. I did call. I told my sister exactly that, gently, the way I was good at being gentle, and I remember hanging up afterward and sitting on my dorm room floor with a strange, hollow feeling I couldn't name yet, the feeling of having been drafted, without ever being asked, into managing my sister's crisis on top of having just quietly set aside my own good news to do it. There was a subtler version of the same thing at my college graduation 4 years later, which both my parents did attend, to be fair to them, but which my mother spent a visible portion of on her phone, texting back and forth with Della, who was in the middle of the breakup that would eventually consume the better part of a year. I remember catching my father's eye across the folding chairs at one point, during the actual ceremony, and seeing something apologetic pass over his face. A look that said, without either of us saying anything, "I know, and I'm sorry, and I don't know how to fix it either." That was often as far as it went with my father, a look, a small kindness offered sideways, never a direct correction of my mother, because correcting my mother required a kind of confrontation he had built his entire marriage around avoiding. There was a scene when I was 26 that I want to tell you about, because it's the clearest early instance of the pattern, and because it's the scene my aunt brought up to me, years later, in a conversation that changed how I understood everything. I was in Cincinnati then, in my first real apartment, and I lost my job in a round of layoffs 3 weeks before my rent was due. And I was too proud, or too well trained, to call my parents and ask for help. I called my Aunt Ruth instead, my mother's older sister, a blunt, warm woman who had never had children of her own and had always treated Della and me with an even-handedness that, looking back, I think was deliberate, a kind of correction she was making without ever saying so out loud. I told Aunt Ruth I was fine. I have always told everyone I was fine. But something in my voice must have given me away, because a week later, an envelope showed up at my apartment with $400 in it and no note, and when I called to ask if she'd sent it, she said carefully that she couldn't take credit, that it wasn't from her. I let it go. I assumed at the time that it was some administrative refund I'd forgotten about, or a mistake, and I used the money and did not think about it again for 6 years. Which tells you something about how thoroughly I had trained myself not to look too closely at anything that might complicate the story I told myself about my family. Now I want to bring you to the year everything changed. Because I promised to tell this in order, and the order matters. I turned 32 on a Thursday in October. My parents had unusually planned something a little larger than usual. My mother had called 6 weeks ahead to say she'd booked the private room at the Copper Kettle, the one restaurant in Millbrook nice enough to require a reservation, the place we'd only ever eaten at for anniversaries and confirmations, and she'd said, with what I now recognize as real effort in her voice, that she wanted this one to be special. Because 32 felt like a birthday that had gotten lost in the shuffle of turning 30 2 years earlier, when Della had been going through her divorce and the whole family's attention had bent, understandably, toward her. I remember hanging up the phone that day and sitting very still in my kitchen for a long moment, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. I flew home. I took 2 vacation days I could not really spare, in October, our busiest season at the firm, because my mother had made a reservation, and made an effort and said the word special. And some very young part of me wanted, badly, to believe that this meant something had shifted. I got the call 4 days before I flew out. I was standing in my own kitchen in Portland, 3,000 miles from the copper kettle, when my mother's name came up on my phone, and I answered it already smiling, expecting to talk about what time my flight landed. Her voice was different before she said a single word about the reason. Tight, quick, already halfway somewhere else. She told me Della's husband had moved out that morning. Not separated, not talking about separating, gone, boxes in his car, gone by noon. She told me Della had called her sobbing from the bathroom floor of the house they'd bought together 18 months before, and that she, my mother, was driving there now, and that she didn't think, her voice did something apologetic here, a small dip I have replayed more times than I can count. She didn't think this was the week for the dinner. I said that was fine. I want you to know I said that was fine, and that in the moment, I meant it. Or meant to mean it. Della's marriage was collapsing. That is not a small thing, and I have never, even in my worst moments about all of this, believed that my mother should have chosen a restaurant reservation over her daughter sobbing on a bathroom floor. That is not the boundary I am telling you about. The boundary is smaller and stranger and took me a long time to be able to name, and it arrived 4 days later, at the copper kettle, which my mother had decided, I only learned this after the fact, to keep the reservation for, but with Della there instead of me. Because Della, she said, needed cheering up, and it seemed like it might do her good to get out of the house, and the room was already paid for, so why let it go to waste? Nobody told me this ahead of time. I found out because Della posted a photograph, cake, candles, my parents on either side of her, the private room I had pictured myself sitting in, captioned with a joke about turning a bad week around, and I sat on my apartment floor in Portland with my rescheduled flight still open in a browser tab and looked at a photograph of my own birthday dinner, thrown for my sister, in the restaurant that had been booked weeks earlier in my name. I called my mother that night. I did not scream. I want to be precise about that, because in the version of this story I told myself for a long time afterward, I remembered myself as calmer than I actually was, and I remembered her as crueler than she actually was. And neither of those things turned out to be quite true when I finally forced myself to sit with the actual transcript of what was said. I asked her, my voice shaking in a way I hated, why she hadn't told me, why she'd let the reservation happen without me, why it hadn't occurred to her to simply move the date instead of moving the guest of honor. And my mother, who I do believe loves me, who was exhausted and frightened for her other daughter and running on almost no sleep, said the thing that has been sitting in my chest for 3 years like a swallowed stone. She said, Marin, please, not tonight. Your sister's whole world just fell apart, and I need you to be the one who understands that. I need you to not make this about you. I did not say anything else that night. I said I understood, and I hung up, and I did not call again for 11 days, and when I finally did, neither of us mentioned it. And that has been the shape of every conversation with my mother since, a wide, careful berth around a hole in the floor that both of us know is there, and neither of us will look down into. I want to tell you about the space between then and now, because it wasn't a single dramatic rupture, it was a slow withdrawal that looked, from the outside, like nothing much at all. I still called on Sundays at first, though the calls got shorter. I still sent a card for her birthday. I did not fly home for Thanksgiving that year and told everyone it was a scheduling conflict at work, which was half true. I did not fly home the Thanksgiving after that either. My father called me twice, in that first year, in a way he almost never did on his own, and both times he talked around the subject in his gentle sideways way, asked if I was doing all right. Said your mother misses you. Said Della's doing better now, in case that matters to you, and both times I told him I was fine. Because I have always told everyone I was fine, and because I did not yet have the words for what I actually wanted to say, which was, I don't think anyone in that house has ever once asked what it costs me to keep being the one who's fine. My mother, for her part, seemed to genuinely believe the incident had been minor and mostly forgotten, which I understand now was not obliviousness so much as a lifetime of practice not looking too hard at the cost of her own choices. She would mention, in our thinning phone calls, that she hoped I'd come for Christmas. She would mention once that she still had the photograph from Della's dinner up on the refrigerator and ask, with what I think was genuine and blind hopefulness, whether I wanted her to send me a copy, since I hadn't been able to make it. I did not answer that question. I have never told her how that particular offer landed. There was one scene in this stretch of years that I have to tell you about, because it is the moment someone outside the immediate wreckage looked directly at what was happening and named it. And I have never forgotten the specific discomfort of being seen like that. It was my cousin Priya, Aunt Ruth's daughter, at a family gathering the following spring, a baby shower for a cousin, one of the few events I still made myself attend, because it felt safe, adjacent to the family rather than embedded in it. Priya cornered me by the drinks table and asked, without any preamble, whether I was okay, because she'd heard from her mother some version of what had happened with the birthday, and she said, quietly, watching my face, "You know you're allowed to be angry about that, right? That's not you being dramatic. That's just a genuinely messed up thing to do to a person." I remember deflecting hard, the way I always deflected, laughing it off, saying families are complicated, saying I was over it, and Priya looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between pity and frustration, and said, "Only, okay. Well, I'm not going to push, but I don't think you're over it," and then she let it go. Because she is kind, and because she understood, correctly, that I wasn't ready. She found me again, briefly, later that same afternoon, refilling her cup at the same drinks table, and added, almost as an afterthought, that her own mother, my Aunt Ruth, had said something similar once, years before, about how families sometimes build one member into the household thermostat. The person whose job is simply to hold steady, so everyone else has permission to fluctuate. I laughed at the time, a little uncomfortably, and said that sounded about right, and did not let myself think too hard about what it meant that even the people on the outside of my immediate family had apparently noticed the arrangement long before I was willing to. I want to be fair to my mother here, because the shape of this story depends on being fair to her, and because the version where she is simply a villain is not the true version. My mother did not do what she did out of malice. I have turned this over for 3 years, and I do not believe, even now, that she woke up that October morning and decided to humiliate me. What I believe, and what took me a long time to be able to hold at the same time as my own hurt, is that my mother had spent 30 years training herself, the same way she trained me, to go toward whichever daughter was in crisis, and that by the time Della's marriage collapsed, that training was so deep in her it operated below the level of conscious choice. She did not weigh my birthday against Della's breakdown and decide Della mattered more. She simply didn't weigh it at all. The scale had only ever had one side. I should tell you more plainly what Della was actually going through that October, because it deserves to be told without irony or resentment folded into it. Her husband, Tom, had not simply grown restless. He had been having an affair for the better part of a year with a coworker and had timed his leaving with a kind of cowardice that left Della with almost no warning at all. Just boxes in the car and a note on the kitchen counter that she would not let anyone read for months. She had, at that point, quit a job 6 weeks earlier to try to have a baby with him, a decision she'd made in good faith. and she found out 3 days after he left that she was, in fact, pregnant, and lost the pregnancy 2 weeks after that, alone, in a house she could no longer afford on her own income, before she'd even had the chance to tell anyone besides my mother that she was carrying it at all. I did not know any of this in real time. I learned most of it much later, in pieces, the way families eventually let out the worst of a bad year once enough time has passed that it feels survivable to say out loud. Knowing it now, I cannot imagine asking my mother to have made a different choice that particular week. Nobody should have to defend choosing their daughter's bathroom floor over a dinner reservation, and I have never, even at my angriest, believed my mother was wrong to go to Della that day. That is the honest constraint, and I don't think it's fair to call it a villain, though it took me years to be able to say that without my jaw tightening. My mother's whole adult life has been organized around the belief that love means showing up hardest wherever the emergency is loudest, and Della has, through no real fault of her own, spent 30 years being the loudest room in the house. There is a scene from that same stretch of time, the one time, in those 3 years, that the pattern was tested openly, rather than simply repeated, that I think belongs here, because it shows both of them choosing, in the moment, not to name what everyone in the room could feel. It was a smaller gathering, my father's 60th birthday, the following summer, and Della, of all people, brought it up, quietly, to my mother, in the kitchen, while I was setting the table and could hear through the doorway without either of them realizing. She said something like, "Mom, you know Marin's dinner thing still bothers her, right?" And my mother's voice went thin and defensive in a way I recognized instantly. She said, I know, I've thought about it. I don't know what you want me to do about it now. It's done." And Della, to her credit, pushed a little further, said, "Maybe you could just say something to her." And my mother said, quickly, "Not tonight. Your father's having a nice night. Let's not make it about that." And I stood in the next room with a stack of napkins in my hands and understood, with total clarity, that the boundary was not going to move. Both of them, in that kitchen, chose the quiet, chose the unspoken, chose to let the thing sit exactly where it had been sitting, because naming it out loud felt more dangerous than carrying it silently. I did not say anything either. I finished setting the table. There is a smaller scene I should include here, from the Christmas I did not attend, the second one, because my absence itself became a kind of event that year in a way I only heard about secondhand. My father told me, months later, in one of his careful sideways calls, that my mother had set a place for me anyway, out of habit or hope or both, and that Della had, at some point during dinner, quietly moved the extra plate to the sideboard without saying anything, and that nobody had spoken about it, and that my mother had gone very quiet for the rest of the meal. I don't tell you this to make my mother the object of pity. I tell you because it was the first evidence I had, second-hand as it was, that my absence had actually registered as a loss in that house, rather than simply as the continuation of my usual, convenient ease. For years I had believed, on some level, that I could be subtracted from Millbrook without the equation changing very much. That empty chair, and the quiet after Della moved the plate, was the first crack in that belief, though it would be another year before I understood what was actually sitting underneath it. Time did what time does, which is keep moving regardless of whether anything gets resolved. Della, over the following year, put her life back together in the visible, dramatic way she had always put things back together: a new apartment, a promotion at her job, eventually a new relationship that my mother talked about with the kind of relief that made it clear how much she had been carrying. My own life, in Portland, quietly deepened in ways nobody in Millbrook was watching closely enough to notice. I got promoted to lead designer on the hospital courtyard projects. I bought a small house with a garden I redesigned 3 times before I was satisfied with it. I I built a close, chosen circle of friends who knew, because I eventually told them the whole shape of what had happened with my family, and who did not tell me I was making too much of it, which I did not realize, until I heard it, how badly I had needed someone to simply believe me. I did not go home for 2 more Christmases. My father called more, in that stretch, careful calls where he never quite asked me to forgive anything, just asked how I was, told me small news. The neighbor's dog, a new roof, Della's promotion. The way you'd feed information gently into a room you weren't sure was safe to enter. I loved him for those calls, even as I kept my answers short. My mother and I spoke perhaps 6 times a year, birthdays and holidays, brief, warm on the surface, and entirely silent underneath. 2 people conducting a relationship almost entirely out of the topics we had both silently agreed never to raise. The discovery came almost 2 years after the birthday, and it did not come from my mother at all. It came from my Aunt Ruth on a Tuesday afternoon in March in a phone call I almost didn't answer because I was between meetings and assumed it was a routine check-in. Ruth had never been part of the silence the way the rest of the family was. She had always occupied a slightly separate orbit, close enough to know everything, independent enough to say what she actually thought, and, that day, she called. She told me later, because she'd had a small stroke scare the week before. Nothing serious in the end, but enough to shake something loose in her about things she'd been meaning to say for years and kept putting off. We talked for a while about her health, and then, almost as an aside, she said, "I've been wanting to tell you something for a long time, and I think I've just been a coward about it." And I sat down at my kitchen table because something in her voice told me to. She asked if I remembered the envelope, the $400, my 26th year, the layoff, the rent I couldn't cover. I said of course I remembered. I'd assumed for years it was some clerical mistake I'd never bothered to track down. Ruth was quiet for a second, and then she said, "It wasn't a mistake, Marin. It was your mother." I want to tell you exactly how that landed, because it did not land the way you might expect. It did not feel, at first, like relief or vindication. It felt like the floor tilting very slightly under a piece of furniture I had trusted completely. Ruth explained it slowly, the way you explain something you've been sitting on so long it's grown roots. My mother had called her, back then, the week after I'd mentioned to Ruth, in an offhand, trying to sound fine way, that money was tight. Ruth hadn't even told my mother the specifics, just mentioned in passing that I sounded stressed. My mother had asked Ruth to send it and to say nothing because, Ruth told me, your mother said. And I remember Ruth's exact words because I made her repeat them. She said, "Marin would never take it from me directly. She'd tell me she was fine and hang up, so I need you to be the one who sends it, and don't ever tell her it was from me." Ruth told me that wasn't the only time. There had been a scholarship shortfall in graduate school that my mother had quietly closed out through a payment routed to the bursar's office that I had always assumed was some departmental grant I'd half forgotten applying for. There had been, more recently, a security deposit on my Portland house that had shown up 11 days late from an insurance refund I never remembered filing a claim for, which Ruth confirmed, gently, had also come from my mother, timed and disguised so I would never think to ask. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call ended. I want to be honest that my first reaction was not gratitude. My first reaction was something closer to anger, sharper than any anger I'd let myself feel about the birthday itself. Because what Ruth had described was not simply love, it was love with a condition attached that I had never agreed to and had never even known existed. A condition that said, "You may be cared for, but only if you never know you are being cared for. only if the caring never costs me the discomfort of you actually needing me out loud. I remember standing up at some point during that call, pacing the small stretch of kitchen floor between the stove and the window, the phone hot against my ear, and feeling a strange, disorienting doubleness, grateful to a stranger's version of my mother, furious at the one I'd actually grown up with, both feelings occupying the same body at once with no clean way to separate them. I thought, sitting there, of every phone call where I'd said I was fine and my mother had let me say it. Every birthday quietly smaller than my sister's. Every "don't make this about you," and I thought, she had the money. She had it in her the whole time, the impulse to take care of me, and instead of ever once letting it be visible, she buried it. Because visible care for me apparently required a kind of directness she reserved only for the daughter who was already crying loudly enough that there was no way to pretend not to notice. I went back over the years that night, the way you go back over a house looking for a draft you can finally feel but couldn't locate before. I remembered the graduate school email 3 years earlier, informing me that an anonymous departmental hardship fund had covered the balance I owed the bursar. I had assumed, at the time, that it was some general fund the university kept for exactly this purpose, and I had written a grateful, generic thank you email into the void, never once imagining a face behind it. I remembered the insurance refund on the Portland house 11 days late that I'd mentioned once, in passing to my mother on a Sunday call, saying only that it was strange, that I didn't remember filing anything, and I remembered her saying, quickly, "Oh, that happens sometimes. Don't worry about it," in a voice I had not at the time thought twice about. It is a strange kind of vertigo, realizing that a decade of your own biography has a second author you never knew was writing alongside you, invisibly, in the margins. I called Aunt Ruth back 2 days later, once I'd stopped shaking every time I thought about it, and asked her as evenly as I could, why? Why hide it? Why let me believe, for a decade, that my mother's love only ever showed up loudly for Della and never for me, when apparently it had been showing up for me too, just wearing a disguise? Ruth was quiet for a while, and then she said something I've turned over many times since. She said, "I think your mother has never once believed that you would let her love you the plain way. She thinks you built a wall a long time ago that says I'm fine, don't worry about me, and she has spent your whole adulthood too afraid of that wall to try knocking on the front of it. So she started sneaking in through the side. I don't think that makes it right, Marin. I just think it might make it make sense." I flew home 6 weeks later. I had not planned to. I had told myself for 2 years that I was building a life that simply did not require Millbrook in it anymore, and I believed that, mostly. Right up until the morning I found myself booking a flight without fully deciding to. My mother did not know I was coming until I was already in the driveway. I hadn't wanted to give either of us time to prepare a performance. She came to the door in gardening gloves, dirt on her knees, and her face did something complicated when she saw me. Happiness first. Unguarded and immediate. And then, right behind it, a wariness that told me she understood, on some level, that I hadn't come for a casual visit. We sat in the kitchen. I remember the specific detail of the clock on her stove being 11 minutes fast, the way it had been my entire childhood, nobody ever fixing it, everyone simply learning to subtract 11 minutes in their heads. I told her what Ruth had told me. I watched her face while I said it, and I want to tell you honestly that she did not deny it, and she did not at first apologize either. She went very still, the way I imagine she goes still in the actual emergencies she's so good at handling, and she said quietly, "I didn't know if I should ever tell you that. I thought if you knew, you'd feel like you owed me something. And I didn't want you to feel that. I wanted you to just be okay." She asked me, at one point quietly, whether I remembered the lunches I used to pack myself, back when I was 9, and I told her I did, and she said, I used to watch you do that from the hallway sometimes and think, thank God, at least I don't have to worry about that one. And I didn't understand until much later what I was actually teaching you when I thought that. I said nothing for a moment, because I had never once considered that she had seen those mornings at all. I had always assumed, in the version of my childhood I carried around, that I had been genuinely invisible during Della's emergencies. And it undid something in me to learn that I had in fact been seen, and that the seeing had simply been filed away as relief instead of worry. I asked her, and my voice broke a little here, why it was easier for her to send money in secret than to simply show up for my birthday. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, she didn't defend herself, which surprised me more than anything else that happened that day. She said, I think I got used to you not needing anything from me, and I think somewhere along the way I mistook that for you not wanting anything from me, and I let myself off the hook because of it. And then, and this is the part I have replayed the most, she said, I don't think I know how to love someone who isn't falling apart. Marin, I've spent 30 years learning how to do that for your sister, and I never learned the other thing, the quiet thing. Showing up when nothing's wrong, and I think that's the thing you actually needed from me, and I think I missed it for your whole life. I did not tell her I loved her in that kitchen, and she did not say it to me either, not directly, not the way this might resolve in a story built for a tidier ending. What we did instead was sit with the clock running 11 minutes fast and let the thing sit named, out loud, in the room, for the first time in 3 years. I told her the reservation had broken something in me that I hadn't fully repaired, and that the money, even though I now understood it as love, had also, in its own way, confirmed something painful, that I had never once been allowed to need her plainly, only in code. Only through an intermediary, only in a form small enough not to disturb the larger architecture of the house. She did not argue with that. She said, I hear that. I don't know how to fix 30 years in an afternoon, but I hear that. We sat quietly for a while after that, the way you sit after saying something true, and not quite knowing what to do with the room once it's been said. Eventually she asked me, in a smaller voice than I'd ever heard her use, whether I hated her. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't, that I had spent a long time trying to. Because hating her would have been simpler than the thing I actually felt, which was something closer to grief. Grief for a version of my childhood that could have existed if she'd known how to love me in the plain, unremarkable way she'd learned to love Della in the loud way. And grief that it had taken 32 years and a stranger's slip of the tongue for either of us to say any of this out loud. She reached across the table then, and put her hand over mine, which she had not done since I was small enough to need help crossing a street, and she did not say anything else, and I let her hand stay there, and that, more than anything either of us said, is the moment I keep coming back to when I try to explain to anyone why I went home at all that day. I want to tell you about the pie, because I promised you it would come back, and it came back in the smallest, most undramatic way, which felt, in the end, like the truest way it could have. Before I left that afternoon, my mother went to the freezer and came back with a small, foil-wrapped shape. And she said, almost shyly, I made this in October, on your actual birthday, the real one. And I didn't send it because I didn't know if you'd want anything from me, and I didn't know how to ask, and it's probably freezer burned by now, but I kept it, because I didn't know what else to do with it. It was a lemon icebox pie, made for a birthday that had already passed, kept frozen for months, by a woman who apparently hadn't known how to hand it to me directly. I did not cry in front of her. I cried in the car, in the driveway, for a long time, before I could make myself drive away. I want to be honest about where things stand now, because I don't think this is a story that ends with a reconciliation tidy enough for anyone to applaud. I did not move back to Millbrook. I did not become the daughter who calls every Sunday and flies home for every holiday, and I don't think I ever will, and I have made a kind of peace with that. What changed is smaller, and I think more durable than a full repair. I call my mother now when I actually want to talk to her, not out of the old, vigilant duty, and those calls are fewer. But they are real. In a way, the Sunday calls of my 20s mostly weren't. I told her, that day in the kitchen, that I needed her to say things to my face from now on, whatever they were, even the hard ones, and that I would rather have one honest sentence from her than another secret kindness routed through my aunt, and she has, mostly, tried. Not perfectly. Last year she nearly did it again, mentioned, offhand, that she was thinking of hosting my birthday and Della's engagement party the same weekend to save everyone travel, and I heard the old shape of the pattern trying to reassemble itself, and this time I said something. I said, plainly, not defensively, I need my birthday to just be my birthday this year, Mom. And she went quiet on the phone for a second, and then she said, okay. Just that. Okay. And she kept the dates separate. And it was, in its own unglamorous way, the first time I had ever asked my mother directly for something and simply been given it, without a phrase like "don't make this about you arriving to close the door." I still have not gone back for a birthday since. I don't know if I will this year. There's a version of this story, I know, that would end with me flying home every October now, the two of us laughing over a fresh pie in a kitchen finally set right, and I want to be honest that this is not that version, because I don't think a single afternoon in a kitchen undoes 30 years of a house built the way ours was built. What changed is quieter than that, and I think, in its own way, more real. My mother sends a card now every year that arrives on the actual day, not the week after, not folded into someone else's occasion. And inside it, she has started writing small, specific things, not "I love you." We still don't say that easily. Either of us. But things like "I still remember the color of the dress you wore the year you turned 8, or "this year, I made the pie again, on the right day this time, and ate a slice myself so it wouldn't just sit there." It isn't everything. I have caught myself, more than once, waiting for the year it slips again, for some new emergency of Della's to swallow mine the way it always used to. And I don't know yet whether that fear will ever fully quiet down. But I have also caught myself, this past year, saying what I need out loud instead of swallowing it, and being, more often than not, actually heard. That is new. That is not nothing. Della and I talked. Eventually, too, carefully, the way siblings do when neither one wants to relitigate a childhood neither of them fully chose the shape of. She told me she hadn't known, that year, that the dinner had even been mine originally. My mother had told her only that the room was already booked and it seemed a shame to waste it, and Della, drowning in her own grief, had not thought to ask more questions than that. I believe her. I don't think Della ever set out to take anything from me. I think we were both, in our own ways, handed roles before we were old enough to negotiate them, and spent 30 years playing them out faithfully, the way children do, long after we were old enough to know better. She cried a little, on the phone telling me this, and said something I haven't been able to shake since, that growing up, she used to envy me, actually envy me, for being the one nobody worried about, because to her it looked like trust, like my parents simply believing I could handle anything, while she was the one everyone assumed was fragile. It had never once occurred to her that what looked like trust from her side of the house might have felt, from mine, like being quietly set down and left. We didn't resolve that difference so much as simply let each other see it, both of us a little stunned to learn how differently the same house had been built for each of us. Somewhere in a freezer in Ohio, there might still be a pie with my name on the card, kept a year too long by a woman who finally learned, a little late, that it's allowed to just be handed over. I think, in the end, this is a story about the difference between being cared for and being seen, and how a family can manage the first for decades while quietly failing at the second, without anyone involved ever meaning any harm at all. It is easy, from the outside, to want a story like this to end in a single clean forgiveness, the kind that resolves everything in one warm scene and lets everybody go back to normal. I don't think real families work that way, and I've stopped wishing mine did. What I have instead is smaller, and I think sturdier. A mother who is trying, imperfectly, to love me out loud instead of sideways, and a version of myself who no longer mistakes silence for peace. Love doesn't always arrive the moment you need it, or in the shape you asked for. Sometimes it's been there the whole time, frozen, waiting for someone brave enough to finally hand it across the table. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.